Splinters of a Nation is a documentary film about a little-known topic in American history and Utah history. And that topic is the story of German prisoners of war who were taken here to America during World War II. And this is a story most people have never heard of, and that's why we're creating this film. But specifically in Ogden, there was 4,000 of these German prisoners of war that came right down to the heart of the city. And it's just such an interesting thing for Ogden to have this experience of these enemies, these German prisoners, and then these civilians, these Utahns, and to have them connect here on the home front right here in Ogden. It was very unique to me when I heard about it, but in reality it's not all that unique. This happened across America, in prison camps in 46 out of the 48 states at the time. It wasn't unique, but at the same time it's incredible. And so that's what the film's about, is this connection between German prisoners of war and the Americans, those specifically right here in Utah. I first became interested in making this documentary film when 2 years ago I was interviewing my grandmother, making a life history video about her life, and she told me some great stories, but in the midst of all of these great stories was this amazing story, at least I thought.
So I was in utter disbelief when my father announced that Monday morning a busload of German prisoners of war would come to our farm and work in the fields. They had arranged with the government to let them come and do that because all of our young men were away fighting.
And I remember after she told me that, I stopped her and said, "Are you kidding me? We had German prisoners of war in Utah?" So I started to research this topic a little further, and I quickly realized that my grandmother's experience, while incredible, was really not that unique. In fact, farms across the country had German prisoners of war on their farms during World War II. And nearly 500,000 German prisoners of war in total would come to America during World War II. And so this was a big story, and yet nobody knows about it. In Ogden, there was 4,000 of these prisoners, and the largest prisoner of war camp in Utah was right here in Ogden. These German prisoners of war came from all over the place. A number of them came from North Africa, the fighting that was taking place there. We captured German prisoners of war like crazy, the Allies that is. And as they rounded them up, they had nowhere to put them, and they had put them in England, and soon they brought them here because there was nowhere else to put them. But it was not an easy thing. They would send them over on these Liberty ships that would go over to the conflict without German prisoners, and then they'd come back with a boatload, literally, of these German prisoners, sometimes thousands of prisoners on one boat. And then when they arrived in New York City, they had to get them all over the country. And the way that they did that was by train, of course. So they loaded the German prisoners on trains, and I think it was a 3 or 4 day train ride to get to Ogden, Utah. And many of them came straight from New York City to Ogden and stayed here the rest of their time. The German prisoners of war had a great life in Ogden. All of the ones that I interviewed described wonderful experiences in Ogden.
Ja, und dann haben wir noch einen Tennisplatz gebaut. Den haben wir auch selbst angelegt. Die Netze rundherum, die wurden von der Lagerleitung gestiftet. Und sonst wurde auch Theater gespielt, ein Chor, Blasmusik, Orchester, alles gab es dann da. Also von alles gespielt und durchgeführt von Kriegskameraden. Ne?
The Geneva Convention, which is the laws that governed how prisoners of war should be treated in our custody, in the Allies' custody, suggested that, or subscribed that they needed to be in the same type of quarters that the guards were in. So if the guards were in covered buildings, barracks, then the prisoners needed to be in barracks with the same amenities. If the guards were eating a certain type of food, then the prisoners needed to eat that same type of food. Well, you can imagine this didn't make the residents of Ogden very happy. Because why are the German prisoners of war eating better than we are on our rationed diets? And the German prisoners are eating meat, they're eating salt, all of these things, that the citizens of Ogden didn't necessarily get the best of. They had classes for the German prisoners of war. They could learn English. They could learn about American history, which was very convenient for the Americans to teach them about. The Geneva Convention stated very clearly that the Americans were not to re-educate or to push democracy on the German prisoners. But my understanding is that the American personnel would in fact re-educate some of these German prisoners. They would give them pamphlets that would describe what the American way of life was, and they would teach them about democracy and why it was better than fascism, than the Nazi, Hitler and the Nazi Party. They would do all of these things in hopes that these German prisoners of war would go back to their homeland and start a different country after the war. German prisoners of war were required to work while in Ogden, of course, and that was advantageous to Ogden, to the people of Ogden. There was a great labor shortage going on during World War II, as you can imagine. All of the young men were off fighting overseas, and the German prisoners of war filled that void really well. So they would go off of their prisoner of war camp, and they would go on to the farms of citizens across Utah, across America. The civilians obviously had some thoughts about these German prisoners of war, and the German prisoners of war had thoughts about the civilians.
Believe me, I was on the back porch when that bus came in, and after they were in the fields hoeing beets, I hid in the ditch, and I just slid along in that ditch and listened to them and watched them, and I couldn't understand what they said, but they were joking with each other, laughing, and I thought, how can this be? They are such mean people. How can they be so happy?
These were our enemies. But over the course of a summer, in my grandmother's experience, she learned to really like these guys. They would show her pictures of their families back home. My grandmother realized that they have kids her age that are overseas, and they don't know what's happening to them. She would see their tears flow when they would look at pictures of their kids, and she realized that they're human beings above all. And I think that this type of feeling took place all over America. In fact, I can say I know it did because we've interviewed other folks that have had similar experiences. We've been flooded with people telling us their stories of how much they grew to like these enemies of theirs. In all, the German prisoners of war were treated very well. They were happy here. The American guards were taught to treat them firmly but kindly. And so the German prisoners of war had a good life. It was paradise for them. There was a lot of mixed emotions: happiness, sadness, excitement, relief, fear because of what their family was going through back at home. That's where we get the title of the film, Splinters of a Nation, because one prisoner from Ogden described his experience as such, that he was a splinter of his nation, that he was basically saved, as a splinter across the ocean away from the war, and he was just a splinter of his nation which was being crushed. After World War II had ended, the German prisoners, it was time to go home, and every single one of them was shipped home. Nothing really remains from the German prisoner of war camp in Ogden that I know of. For example, where the German prisoner of war camp was is just a field now. There's a nursing hospital there for World War II vets. A lot of them are there. It's a veterans hospital. The response from people in Ogden when they hear that I'm doing this documentary is always interesting. They've never heard about it. The largest prisoner of war camp was in Ogden, in Utah. And so you would think that people would know about it, the memories would still remain, and yet everyone I talk to, without fail, unless they're over 75 years old, has never heard of this story. But there's things that I've learned. For example, I'm inspired by the connection that was made between German prisoners of war and Americans. I'm inspired by how they could put the differences of war behind them, and they could talk to one another, they could become friends, and some of them could create connections that lasted 70 years. To me, that's inspiring because it's difficult to think of the enemy as human. It's difficult to think of them as having families, of having kids, of having similar challenges that I have. And so for me, this story provides an experience on display of German prisoners of war and Americans, two enemies, getting to know one another and realizing that they're not all that different.